What does a beautiful life looks like? I believe we are going to agree that a beautiful life is one where you have peace, where there is enjoyment, and where you have sound health, essentially. But if this discussion runs deeper, I'm very confident that it is going to evolve into one where we start to describe a beautiful life as one where there is not so much chaos happening in it, as one where there is sufficient affordability ultimately, and one where the individual appears to be blessed with the things that the society regards as indicators of peace, wealth, prosperity, and things in that category. Because even if the vast majority have not personally experienced this themselves, from what is apparent, we all agree that a life that is marked by tranquility, peace, frequent happiness, and joy, and that is free of desperation, no matter how little or how seldom, and worry or sadness or sorrow, is better compared to one that is devoid of this goodness and that seems to be woven into the latter. A great philosopher even asserted that pleasure is the beginning and the end of the blessed life. Another one said, human nature is good, which is to say, suffering and tribulations are not essential to life because obviously the human nature is inherently good. Contrary to how philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche try to make us see living as equivalent to suffering. But here's the question: if the absence of suffering and tribulation and the presence of all this aforementioned goodness are indicators of a beautiful and blessed life, why do people we know to have these things at the tip of their fingers sometimes come out to talk about being unhappy and sad or anxious and depressed, when we all agreed that all that is needed to have this beautiful, great, and glamorous life is to be in these people's positions? I think whenever you're trying to pry into any phenomenon that you have little to zero precedented conviction about, I think it's very important that you don't just pry into arguments that support your biases alone, but also into counter arguments. Because by doing this, I believe you can then be able to form an even more solid conviction about which feels right by you. For instance, it is not a lie that most of humans' suffering are built by distortion, neglect, or injustice, and that nature itself is relatively good to humanity. At the same time, it is not a fallacy, to use Schopenhauer's words, that life swings like a pendulum backward and forward between pain and boredom. More often than not, two truths can, in fact, coexist, but which is more grounded usually tends to be the bone of contention. So, to judge from what is obvious and much more realistic, can we all agree without contestation that life is good, or in the other word, fair to all? Of course, now. And if this a blessed, beautiful life is marked by bliss and the absence of deprivation, is such life then the reality of everyone? To that also, which the answer is obviously no. Now, so if this life is unattainable by all and to all, does it then equate to everyone else's life is there and meant to be awful, while the rest that is are done with this goodness alone can have a blissful life existence? Personally, I think the one mindset that answers this very question is one that deeply understands that the two arguments about life and suffering are both valid and is ready to shuffle through that. To use David Hume's words, human happiness and mystery are not so much the product of what happens to us as of how we feel about it. Because even though the reality of a life that is rather devoid of this goodness and seems to be soaked in deprivation is painful, the way we have known to see these inevitables and interpret their trajectory appears to be what makes living amidst these factors even more unbearable. We all know that the possibility of a life that is totally and at all time free of these circumstances is unattainable, even among those we perceive to have these beautiful lives. When we are faced with difficulties or strains of any form, as a matter of course, what torments us the most isn't usually the despair itself, but our view of despair. When you feel or believe you're suffering, usually it is not the suffering that you feel so desperate about, but the way you have been conditioned to see and interpret your suffering. Sometimes as a punishment, as a result of your circumstances and ABCD. And that is not to quote this, it is all up in your head, because sometimes certain situations are that excruciating. But when you start to take undesirable conditions, name it, circumstances, emotion, feelings, and situation, even when you know it to be the residue of a certain situation or circumstance, as part of the inevitables of life, where no matter how fortunate or the opposite you are, everyone is bound to get his own fair share of those. The way that you feel about your suffering start to take a different shape. And that is not to gullibly assure you that this does something to your suffering, because as you know, unless you try to change it, there is hardly any situation that pretty much automatically changes on its own. But when the battle of the mind is out of the battles that you have to fight, the rest of the problem can then come to seem very less challenging. And by means of this, you can objectively focus on what is actually in front of you rather than much more than what it makes you look like or the way it measures, essentially.